Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jenna Ben-Yehuda. I'm the president and CEO of the Truman National Security Project. We are a next generation community of incredible national security leaders. We have three terrific panelists here today, all of whom are friends of Truman and members as well. So this is a real delight, although the topic is certainly a concerning one. And so without further ado, I'm going to jump right into it. We're really thrilled to have Congresswoman Sara Jacobs. It sounds so good to hear those words together. Welcome. Just a few short weeks after being sworn in, I think it's fair to say that Congresswoman Jacobs has had among the most eventful first 3 weeks of congressional tenure, along with your other freshman colleagues. Congresswoman Jacobs comes from the California's 53rd District in San Diego. We are also joined by Congressman Jason Crow from Colorado's 6th District, also former Army enlisted. Congresswoman Jacobs also served at State Department, conflict and stabilization operations, and a range of roles. Everybody has the full bios, but just a few highlights here. And last but not least, welcoming Congressman Ruben Gallego from Arizona's 7th. Welcome, Mr. Congressman. Congressman Gallego is a Marine combat veteran. And so all of you here, in addition to being part of the Democratic membership of the House Armed Services Committee, all come from a history of service, military and diplomatic frontline civilian service. And we are here today to talk about the impact of the events at the Capitol, the insurrection, the incitement to violence by the former president, and the resulting calls for congressional accountability. We are on the record today. We will have a Q&A portion beginning at 1:30. We invite you to enter your questions together with your affiliation in the Q&A function, and we will get to as many of those as we can. Just to start us off here, I'd love to hear from each of you. Congresswoman Jacobs, you were in the chamber on the 6th. Can you tell us a bit about what these first weeks have been like for you, and some of your early engagement, especially in the early days of the Biden administration, engaging with the Secretary of Defense, now confirmed Secretary Austin. We'll be focusing a lot of our attention on DoD accountability measures. Would love to hear from you, Congresswoman, some of your reflections, having been in the gallery at the time.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I think all three of us were in the chamber. I was very fortunate actually to be sitting near Jason and a few of our other colleagues who have experience in the military and in law enforcement, and they really were amazing, making sure that we all knew what to do, and Ruben was making sure we knew how to put the masks on. So it was, I was joking with someone earlier today. I was like hiding there. We were all scared, and I was like, by the way, hi, I'm Sara. It's nice to meet you. So it was my 4th day in office in the gallery. I think many of you have heard the stories of what happened in the chamber that day. We had to evacuate, we had to hide, we could hear a lot of what was going on. It was pretty scary. And I immediately went back to my office once we were all clear, and had a glass of whiskey with Jason, and then, who's my neighbor, and then decided that it was important that we call for impeachment because as Jenna mentioned about my background, I've worked at the UN and the State Department in conflict settings, in actually post-coup transitions in a number of cases. And so I know how important that accountability piece is when you have political violence, because when you look across the different case studies, when you don't have that highest level of accountability the first time you have a violent incident, you're much more likely to get future such instances. And so, I'm grateful we're having this conversation about accountability, because I really do think that's one of the most important things that we need to be doing right now in order to preserve our democracy.
Well, thank you. And so Congressman Crow, obviously solid Army training on the whiskey front. Can you talk a little bit about, impeachment is one tool, certainly, of accountability, but it certainly is just a beginning. Can you talk a little bit about what you're hoping to see from the Biden administration as Congress moves to wrap its head around those events and how we might prevent them in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna, and thank you for helping put this together. Thank you to Truman for convening this group. I actually am a Trumanite as well, a former Truman Fellow. I guess you could say current Truman Fellow. Once a fellow, always a fellow.
Once and always.
And obviously have a special place in my heart for the Truman Network and everything that you all do. So thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I think it is important. I mean, our position has long been, I know Ruben and Sara share this because I know I've heard them say it, that you can't have unity and move forward without accountability and truth, right? Because we're at this moment in our country's history where our norms are being reset in a very negative way. We're battling the normalization of some very disturbing trends. Disinformation and misinformation is extremely troubling, and the rise of conspiracy theories and homegrown terrorism. You know, we have a homegrown domestic terrorist threat that actually goes way back to Waco and Ruby Ridge and carries forward. You know, the foundations of this have existed for a very long time. But January 6th is widely seen as a catalyzing movement of that domestic terrorism. So now we have to deal with that. And accountability is essential. So of course, impeachment is, the most powerful tool that the Congress has to address it. And that's why we're moving forward, because we feel like we have to, not because we want to. And when I was an impeachment manager this time last year, it's not something I wanted to do. It's something that I felt like I had to do, given my oath. It's what my oath required me to do. Investigations is another. So what's going to happen is we're going to basically have 3 parallel investigations that are going to proceed. There's going to be the Government Accountability Office investigation, and I'm leading that on the House side. Senator Michael Bennett from Colorado is leading on the Senate side, so we're overseeing the GAO investigation. That will take a long time, as they always do, and we're going to release information on a rolling basis. Parallel to that is the federal criminal investigation done by the FBI, which is ongoing, of course, and is very comprehensive. And we'll look at everybody engaged in criminal conduct, regardless of status or whether they're an elected official or not. And then the third is it's very likely that the Congress will put together some style of a 9/11 commission, outside experts to actually look at this and do a holistic assessment as well. And then underlying all of that, currently there's a comprehensive security assessment being done of Capitol Hill, led by Lieutenant General Honore, and the results of that are expected the first week of March. So it's a long way of saying there's a lot going on and on the accountability front, but we have to continue to push back and be vocal about this and say what we will put up with and what we won't in our national discourse.
Absolutely. And Congressman Gallego, as we turn to you, your thoughts on what you see as some of those near-term targets with respect to accountability and the areas in which you've engaged on this.
Well, certainly in terms of near-term targets, besides holding the president, impeaching the presidents, we also need to track down and indict and arrest everyone that entered the Capitol illegally. And I know there's going to be some argument, people like, well, some people, just walked in and we shouldn't hold them accountable. I think this is not a normal trespassing issue. That people were purposely attacking us while we were counting the Electoral College. There was an attempted coup and insurrection that nearly succeeded, to be honest. So I think that is, in terms of the criminal aspects of accountability, that needs to happen. I think also just in terms of just long-term, fixes, like we need to start talking about what, really fed this, and what fed this was politicians feeding the lie and basically continue to feed that fire. One of the things I thought was really interesting, a couple of days before January 6th, I was on Twitter, and somebody, and I can't remember who said that conservative channels and conservative Twitter sounds a lot like Djibouti in the early 90s. I'm sorry, not Djibouti, Rwanda in the early 90s. And that really caught my eye, and actually told my fiance not to travel back with me for January 6th. I felt that something was going to happen. Didn't know it was going to be to the extent of what we saw. But there's going to have to be political accountability. There's going to have to be criminal accountability. There's got to be legal accountability. There's a lot of these organizations that, all these news stations that were selling this lie need to be sued and held liable. You're seeing that happening now with Dominion and Smart. I think Smartmatic is the other tabulation company. But I think there should be other, lawsuits also for these broadcasters to be held, liable, because that's the only thing they understand at the end of the day.
So Congressman Gallego, I want to draw out this, as you begin to kind of lean into this comment on the importance of accountability for those who were engaged in the act of the insurrection on the 6th. There's recent reporting from ProPublica and Frontline through PBS that 1 in 5 of the defendants involved in the Capitol riot cases served in the military. Right, so you've got about 20% involved when 7% of the US population identifies as veteran. So there is a disproportionate amount of those participating in this activity who are themselves affiliated. How do we answer that? Can we talk a bit about infiltration, about DOD's role here? And, worth mentioning that Secretary Austin has called for a military stand down and a review here. Talk to me a bit about what all of you see as the important elements of really meaningful engagement to address infiltration in the military.
So, I mean, first of all, we have to understand that the military still has an overrepresentation of white males. And if you were on the House floor on January 6th, you saw that there was an overrepresentation of white males at the Capitol. So while the numbers, I think, look bad, I hope people don't take from this that this is as dire as it is. Now, it is a problem. So I have talked to Commandant of the Marine Corps and to Secretary of Defense Austin regarding this. And there's two things that need to occur, right? Number one, we need to stop extremists from using the military as a way for that as training grounds, because a lot of people, I think, are missing the point that some of these men and women are coming into the military as extremists already, and they're basically using the military as their training grounds for them to continue in their evolution. Number two, while they are in the military, we do need to have education, multicultural education, even just basic civic education for our men and women. Now, in the military, for a lot of people, it's the first time they're going to meet other people from other diverse classes. To give credit to the military, it's probably one of the best organizations in terms of being able to bring people from minority communities and helping them advance to a certain level and degree. We could get into some of the problems that comes with being officers later, but we need to have a full education for these men and women when they join the military. A lot of them are coming from places that they don't even understand the basic civics of this country. I think it's very odd that we make men and women swear on the Constitution of the United States, but do we actually even know that if they understand the Constitution of the United States? Has someone actually ever taught them about the Constitution of the United States? We don't know that. So maybe we should actually take the time while they're in the military to teach them that. But an increase in making sure that they're being educated, and an actual concentrated effort, which you can see that Secretary Austin is interested in doing, in stamping out extremism in the military, tracking down the men and women in the military that are engaging in whether it's these shadowy chats with extremists, whether they're holding these extremist thoughts and they're not
Sure.
rehabilitating themselves. Things of that nature need to start occurring.
Sure. So Congressman Crow, building off of Congressman Gallego's comments on really looking to the military to screen as people come in the door, certainly to focus on training as a part of the growth of every person as they enter the force. I'd like to turn to you for the other end of that spectrum, which is the UCMJ, this is the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And what recourse do you see there in terms of the ability to prosecute for those crimes, and what other tools DOD may have to address this and really show accountability?
Yeah, so dovetailing on what Ruben just talked about, I think we have to recognize where this problem is coming from. Number one, the military represents our society writ large, right? So the increase of this within the military actually is tracking the increase within society, because Donald Trump and others have reinvigorated and normalized and made acceptable in so many circles, white supremacy, white nationalism, fascism, and other things. So you're seeing that. But it is worse, I think, in the military. And we're going to find that out. We don't have the numbers right now, but we have to do that investigation and get those numbers. I suspect it's worse in the military because you do have groups like the One Percenters and the Oath Keepers and others who specifically are targeting, as Ruben mentioned, the military. But for me, there's kind of four legs to the stool here in terms of countering violent extremism in the military. You have your recruiting leg. We have to do a better job of recruiting a diverse segment of society. And again, Ruben pointed this out. We're at the point where about 80% of our new recruits come from military families. Like we are developing a military culture, a military class within our country. And that's not good for our democracy. It's certainly not good for military-civilian divide. So we have to do a better job of recruiting. Number two, vetting. We have to make sure we're now vetting our recruits for involvement in extremism. And that looks at social media, background, affiliation. Number three is training. Do a better job of training folks. And fourth is the last piece, Jenna, that you started this question with, and that is the accountability piece. None of those other things matter within the military unless you hold commanders accountable for the results and for ruling this out. And that's the UCMJ. That's both the UCMJ and that's the officer and the NCO evaluation system. We have to integrate into that system and their promotion ability, the degree to which they have success of creating and maintaining a diverse force and rooting out extremism. And until that happens, you're just going to have binders of policies sitting on a shelf somewhere.
It's a great point. And we invite folks to start populating our Q&A function. We'll get to you shortly. Congresswoman Jacobs, reflecting back on this growing call, and some of you mentioned this earlier, for a 9/11 style commission to address the insurrection. I was looking back to the 9/11 commission findings, and one of the key elements that really struck me is that this notion of the failure of imagination. That yes, there were intelligence failures, there was a lack of coordination, but there was also a failure of imagination. To what extent, as you reflect back on the events of the last few weeks, do you think that your own grounded and lived experience, having seen this unfold overseas, all of you have in some way, shape, or form, seen the pattern and the path to political violence, what does it mean coming from a place of experience with conflict and stabilization that helps create an informed perspective for you? And also, how might we address that failure of imagination in our own politics? Because as we reflect back on the events of the 6th, all of this was playing out and wide open. People on Twitter, how much room do you have in your trunk for my long gun? I mean, can you meet me at this interstate so we can travel together? This was not hidden away, and yet, from a physical security perspective, certainly nobody was prepared. Would love your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of components to that question. So the first is that I think we need to also think about the way we think about intelligence, because in a lot of cases, because it was public, it wasn't taken as seriously, because surely no one would have publicly talked about these issues, right? And we prioritize the information that we gather secretly. But so much of this recruitment, so much of this is now happening online on social media. And so we need to figure out how we actually take seriously information that is just public and out there. And I can tell you from my experiences working in other countries, that's something that we've long faced, that in many cases the intelligence community doesn't take intelligence as seriously if it's not secretly gathered. I think another component of it is this question of American exceptionalism. I think we all thought that, of course, nothing like this could ever happen here. And in many cases, America is exceptional, I believe in part because of the work we all do to continue trying to live up to our best values. But it did, I think, alter that imagination, that scope of even being able to prepare for what might happen. And we're already seeing people trying to rewrite that history, trying to minimize what happened. And I think we have to be very vigilant at guarding against that. But I think we cannot discount the role of racism and white supremacy in this, because I guarantee you, if it had been a bunch of very armed people of color commenting on the internet about where they were putting their long gun, you can be sure we would have had a very different security posture at the Capitol that day. And so I think we also really need to address the way in our military, as we've talked about, in our law enforcement, in our perceptions of threat and risk in general, racism and white supremacy comes into play, because for certain that was a huge component of why the security posture was so different on January 6th than, for instance, during the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer.
Absolutely, a stark contrast. And so a question for all of you, as we look to impeachment proceedings next week, what do you see as some of the near-term targets? What are you looking for, not just on the Hill, but what do you see as some early indicators that DOD is taking this and really moving the work forward? You talked about the GAO investigation, for example. Important work, takes a long time to do it right. What are some early signs that you feel like the issue has some stickiness and buy-in in especially throughout government, moving some of these slower bureaucracies towards accountability?
Well, certainly right now, this is Ruben. We know that there's still extremists in the military. We just caught the ones that are dumb enough to get caught. So that's one thing that we have to recognize. So the fact that we'll see some success if military actually starts either clamping down on extremism by punishing those that are espousing extremist views. Those that are affiliated with extremist organizations should be drummed out of the military immediately. And so having that work being done right now would actually, I think, help a lot of people feel more comfortable.
Go ahead. Yes, Sarah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, I think that what Secretary Austin is doing with the stand down is a really important first step. And another thing I think we need to also recognize is that you often see a link between these kind of extremist ideologies and violence against women, and that you often can see violence against women as almost the canary in the coal mine. When you're starting to see the uptick in that, it's a good indication that there's likely other extremist ideologies coming in. And so making sure that we're actually addressing the pervasive issue of violence against women in the military. We know we have seen that there have been these issues, whether it was the Fort Hood killing, whether, we've seen these instances of violence. And I think we didn't take enough attention to the fact that that should have been a signal to us that we had a bigger problem we need to address. So making sure we're addressing that issue head on, I think, is also an important step here.
Yeah, the stand down is an obvious quick answer, right? Because what that does is it sends the messages as a command priority. As those of you who've been in the military know, that after an accident or some big incident, you do the stand down, which says, this is a priority. We're sending a very strong message. So that was an important thing to do. Secretary Austin has also initiated kind of an interim 2-week review last week. So we'll get some initial results and assessment of existing policies in the next week or so, but also a more comprehensive 90-day review. So that's going to take about 3 months, of course, from last week, I think it was, when he ordered that to be done. So we're going to have to see. I'm a firm believer in getting the data. I'm a pretty data-driven person because you have to understand what the environment is and what you're dealing with before you figure out how you're going to deal with it. And the bottom line is we just don't have those numbers, right? We don't have a firm grasp on the magnitude of the problem and the exact nature of the problem yet to know what we need to do. So let's get that data. Let's see what the results of that review are, and then we'll have to hold the DoD accountable from a congressional standpoint. But we're also probably going to have to do some legislation too. We're going to have to legislate some of this as well because there's this longer term trend that we noticed under the Trump administration that one of the reasons the Trump administration was able to do some of the things they did is because Congress has ceded our authority for so many decades. We've given up oversight authority and we've given up our power to the executive branch, and the checks and balances are out of whack right now. So we have to kind of reinsert ourselves in some of those processes to fix that.
Great. Well, it's 1:30, and I'm going to keep us on track here. So we invite folks at this time to enter your questions into the Q&A function. Press especially, please identify yourselves and your outlet. I want to start first here with a question from Shellberg, who asks, with respect to specific reference to social media, which rigorous, or should there be rigorous courses in critical thinking and evaluation? How do we incorporate that into both basic training and recurring training? In particular, Just Security published, or rather War on the Rocks, I believe, published a really interesting piece about social media infiltration, misinformation in the military in particular. So what do you see as the role of platforms in both addressing this from a control perspective and moderation perspective, but then also from a training element as part of the four legs of that CVE continuum that you addressed?
Well, I guess I could start. I mean, one of the things that we should really incorporate, we teach men and women, OPSEC, Operation Security, like don't talk about this, don't post this on social media. If you're moving here, don't say anything, right? But we never teach them about critical thinking about what they're reading through social media. And we do know that foreign governments, particularly the Russians, have been trying to influence military members through social media. And there's actually really good examples overseas about helping kind of create resilient, resilient social media habits, specifically Estonia and Finland. And I think we should really look at what they've been able to do to be able to push back on particularly Russian influence. Now, a lot of our problems here aren't just Russian influence; it's just partly that. But there is a right-wing movement that is, particularly strong on the internet and on social media. And it is not a haphazard approach that they're doing. They're very targeted. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly how to spread misinformation. And the reason I tell you this is because I know it. I have, I was enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, so I have a lot of friends I still stay in contact with on Facebook. And they're very strong Trump supporters, but they're also sharing a lot of misinformation that it comes from 3 or 4 core groups, and you could tell that it's particularly targeted at them because of their military background. So we need to figure out how to basically train our military men and women to be able to weed through that, so that when they leave the military, they're not as apt to believe and spread it.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Ruben just said in terms of making this a priority. I mean, this isn't our grandparents' military anymore. I mean, this is now operating within the 21st century in the year 2021, and social media competency, and actually dealing with the threats of state and non-state actors who are trying to manipulate not only our servicemen and women, but our society and pit us against each other is going to be really important. And obviously, there's a larger kind of public education problem here in terms of the degradation of our public education system over the last 40 years plus that we have to resolve as well. But similarly, there's the question you raised, Jenna, about how we deal with the platforms themselves, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and others. And it was fine. I think the appropriate thing to do for those platforms to cut off access to people that were inciting violence and insurrection, promoting violence in the face of very real and verifiable domestic terrorist threats. But that's not a long-term solution, right? We can't have a situation where these companies are making their own decisions in a black box without any kind of transparent rules of the road over who's going to have access and who's not, because that actually drives into the rhetoric of some of these conspiracy theories, that talk about the deep state and all these things. It reinforces some of these conspiracy theories by these groups, but deplatforming them is also not a long-term solution for our democracy either, because it's just going to drive people deeper and create more powerful echo chambers. So we got to figure out a way that we can create rules of the road that protect the First Amendment, that allow us to have public discourse in what is now these new public forums and the now town squares of Twitter, but actually protect people and prevent inciting of domestic terrorism. That's going to be a legislative challenge because Congress has to legislate that, but also the FCC has a role to play as well. So it's not going to be easy, I can tell you that.
Well, and I agree with everything that my colleagues said. When you look at instances of societies or individuals being more susceptible to being recruited to violent extremism, the lack of critical thinking skills is one of the most important things that you see. Sense of threat to identity is another one. And so that is an important component. And, as we look at social media, I think this is another case where we sometimes get caught up in our own American experience. But this is not the first time that violence has been incited on a social media platform. We saw the role that Facebook posts played in the genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar. We've seen it being used against marginalized groups in places around the world. And so, yes, this time they deplatformed Donald Trump, but in so many other instances around the world, those instigators were never deplatformed, and a lot of that rhetoric continues. So in addition to the very important conversation we need to have around content moderation, and as Jason said, really figuring out how we make sure that this is a public discussion around content moderation. We're not outsourcing to private companies the decision of what's allowed in the public sphere. We also need to look at the whole model of our social media ecosystem in general, where the information that gets the biggest reaction is prioritized and incentivized. And that information that gets the biggest reaction is almost always radicalizing. And there have been studies that show, I think you start with a YouTube video on any topic, you keep autoplay on by the 7th video, you're at some extreme position on that topic. So I think this goes much beyond just the individual content moderation to this broader question of actually how we're going to deal with these new technologies and these new communications techniques. And I think Ruben mentioned Rwanda at the beginning of this. When you look at atrocities and when you look at political violence, they almost always coincide with when you have new communications techniques and systems to be able to spread the message, right? So in Rwanda, it was the radio, and now we have to deal with it on social media, whether it's here or around the world. And so I think that will be a really important component in whatever we do moving forward.
Certainly so many lessons to be drawn from overseas to our experience here. And your comment on kind of reimagining American exceptionalism is well taken. That is so much of where Truman's work has really focused on leveraging so many of those lessons. Brings to mind a lot of the concepts of counter-narcotics work in Central America, this defragmentation, working with gangs. I mean, there are so many similarities, and we've seen a lot of this before. It's only just kind of slightly different. Noah Gottschalk asks an important question. What are you doing as members of Congress to ensure that necessary measures to prevent further attacks don't also result in the closure of civil space for nonviolent activists, and that preserve Congress's openness to the American people? Certainly the imagery of the tall fencing around the Capitol is really striking. How do we continue to make this a place that's accessible to the American people?
Yeah, no, I mean, the goal of terrorism is to get us to change ourselves, right? That's one of the biggest goals, is it's the use of violence for political means and actually provoke. The power of terrorism in so many instances is to provoke a reaction that's disproportionate to the power of the terrorist group. And that disproportionate reaction then gets us to change ourselves and creates further conflict within the society, right? So we have to be really careful that we're not falling into that bait, that we're not giving these insurrectionists and these mobs more power than they actually have, which is not much. I mean, they're dangerous, to be sure, and we can't discount them, but we also can't create a larger Frankenstein than actually exists here. So I'm a big believer in the fact that if it was a catastrophic security failure on January 6th. There's just no other way to cut it. So many things went wrong, and we're going to find out some of them, but the intelligence failure was probably the biggest one. This was not hidden. This was being planned in the wide open. And anyone who was paying attention, and people were, just not the right people, could have anticipated what was happening, and we could have had the forces and the capability to respond to it and not let it happen. So intelligence is number one, and that can be done without imposing on public space or changing the way that we interact or what Capitol Hill looks like. And there are other really important things that can be done just to the infrastructure of DC to Capitol Hill that don't include permanent fencing around the Capitol. I don't think I'm gonna wait and see what the assessment shows, but I don't think we need permanent fencing around the Capitol. I think you can create, wrought iron fences, much like they have around the White House, that can actually be put in place and with permanent, holders around the sidewalks. They can be rapidly put in place if the intelligence shows that you need to respond to a large protest or a potential riot that isn't there permanently. And then there are other things you can do with doors and windows and security cameras and automatic lockdowns and other things that actually you can't really even see, that won't change the character of the pantheon of our democracy, as I call it, and change the character of Capitol Hill, that will keep us much, much safer.
Yeah, I agree with Congressman Crow here. The last thing we want to do is let the terrorists win. I mean, they describe the Capitol and members of Congress and politics as these elites that are insular. Well, we look very insular when we have these walls around us. So we need to take those down. There's so many better ways to do security without having these huge barriers that basically tell America that we're afraid of you. And look, this is something that we just have to deal with. This is part of our jobs. I was in the State House when Gabby Giffords was nearly killed through an assassination attempt. And the week after that, members of the State House here in Arizona decided to push back by going and having town halls, and to make sure that the public knew that we were going to continue to be out there, that we weren't going to be afraid. And, for me, I continue to do that. I've had a lot of, this is not my first rodeo dealing with extremism. Being from Arizona, I've been threatened by white supremacists probably for the last 10 years, one way or the other. So I've already installed security protocols in my house for the last 10 years. And just even growing up, I mean, I was a Latino boy in a, working class white area. So I used to get, yelled at, spat at, thrown rocks at. So, I mean, I'm just used to this at this point. And I'm sad that other people are barely recognizing, but this has been around for quite a while. But you have to keep on living life. You can't let these people win by being afraid or by allowing them to show that their terrorism, their violence actually has changed the outcomes.
Yeah, I agree on the security front. I just want to add that we've seen dictators around the world start using this attack as an excuse to curtail civil liberties in their own countries. And I think as we talk about not only the actual security architecture and infrastructure at the Capitol, I think we also need to be very careful that any new laws we make that make it easier to go after some of these domestic terrorists cannot be used to further criminalize Black and brown communities that we know so often is what happens. And even using the same kind of language, terrorism, violent extremism, countering violent extremism, all this language that for so many communities really has been something that they felt has been criminalizing them and has been opposed to them. I think we just need to be really careful in general about what we're doing here to not, further give space to some of the worst instincts of what we can do with these tools.
Well, thank you for that. Just to note that we have a number of questions here that get to the relative balance of voice. And Taylor Hannigan asks a question that captures the sentiment of a number of our attendees today. And Taylor writes, how do we reconcile the notion that conservative voices are being silenced? From Trump's ban from social media, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene's removal from committees, with the fact that many of the things they said are unacceptable in a democracy? And is there a way to address these issues that does not result in pushing people further into their own opinionated echo chambers? How do you navigate that when you have colleagues who don't share those views, who many would argue are not upholding their oath of office?
Well, I'm going to say something very controversial. I think we shouldn't play this game. And here's why. The conservative, especially, some of the right-wing conservatives, play this game all the time, that they're being silenced. So that way it forces mainstream media to give them even more balance, to balance out the arguments, when a lot of times they don't deserve it. Like, they literally are either their views are so extreme, or their views are already being represented in the media, and then they don't need to be overly we don't need to compensate for that. And you see that all the time, where you see mainstream media, because they feel, this sting of, by conservative elite saying that, they're so liberal, that they kind of try to, I would say, they try to balance it out by going the total opposite way, right? There doesn't always have to be two sides to the issue. Sometimes there is a really bad side, and you don't need to give that side the way to it. So, I mean, I think journalism itself needs to relook at, and how they were a part of this. I think, there is no denying that a lot of this, was fed, obviously by media, right-wing media, but some of it had continued to get fed into mainstream media. I'll give you a good example. I remember 2010 with, I'm sorry, or 2001, I can't remember exactly, 2009, with the Tea Party movement. It was clearly a movement based on white grievance, and everybody knew it. But we had media playing to this idea that they just cared about small government, right? And that is, a lot of the same genesis, by the way, and the same people that we found on January 6th, right? I think we need to have our journalistic standards. They need to review and really understand what part they had in all of this. And I don't think we need to play into this game that, like, we're deplatforming them. They have Fox News, OAN, a bunch of other, Washington Times, a bunch of other right-wing platforms in the speak. They don't have a right to have equal balance, especially when a lot of their views are so extreme.
Thank you, Congressman. I want to flag we have 4 minutes because folks need to vote now. So I want to turn, I know Congressman Crow, you wanted to respond to that, and then we'll move for some closing comments, please.
Yeah, there's no silencing of conservative voices, because, and I don't think conservatives would even want to buy into this notion either, because I come from a conservative background. I'm in a conservative family. I know conservative values well, because I grew up around them. And violence is not a conservative value. Bigotry is not a conservative value. Conspiracy theories is not a conservative value. Insurrection against our democracy is not a conservative value. So we're talking about two different things here. I am always willing to have a debate about conservative values versus liberal values versus how to best achieve our common goals. That's not what's at issue. What's at issue is that we have extremism and violence and white supremacy and bigotry that's now a scourge in our democracy, and we have to deal with it. And I should hope, and I still do, that we can deal with it in a nonpartisan way. That those who subscribe to conservative values will join with us to deal with it together, because that's what needs to happen.
Thank you. Congresswoman Jacobs, some final thoughts for us?
Yeah, look, this issue didn't start with January 6th, and it's not going to be something that goes away quickly. I do think it was an important moment for us all to recognize just how deep and pervasive this ideology and extremism goes, not only in our society, but within the military and law enforcement and other entities that we're, increasingly seeing and getting new reports every day of members being a part of the insurrection. And so, my closing thoughts are kind of similar to how I began. I think there are a lot of lessons we can take from other countries that have gone through situations like this, making sure that we're doing the best practices and that we're having truth commissions. We're memorializing what actually happened so that we can't let history be rewritten later to minimize it. That we're really looking at not only the accountability needed for what happened and who incited, encouraged, or committed violence on January 6th, but really at the whole history and the long breaks and fractures in our society that have led to this and that have created an environment and a situation that this could be mobilized around. And then, of course, the enabling environment of social media, of the fact that our institutions are increasingly being seen as less legitimate and less effective, in part because we didn't respond to COVID well. We haven't been able to address many of the challenges that we're facing. And so this kind of hard work of institution building will also, I think, be important as we look moving forward. To working my colleagues on the Armed Services Committee, I'm on the subcommittee for military personnel to look at this extremism in the military, but also the violence against women and the intersection of those two issues. And I know our chairwoman, Jackie Spear, is also eager to work on that. And we know that Secretary Austin and his team are going to take that very seriously.
Well, thank you to all of you. We run a tight ship here at Truman. We really value your time and your expertise, and thank you for your service during this trying time. This is Jenna Ben-Yehuda signing off for Truman National Security Project. Learn more about us at trumanproject.org or on Twitter at Truman Project. Thanks so much to all of you.